Hello, my name is Ted Leja. I'm going to be talking about it's basically history of Canada and Quebec, specifically Quebec in the 1960s, and specifically the year is 1963. Now, we're going to talk about a city called Westmount, which was a separate city on the island of Montreal. And we're going to be talking about the period of May 16th to May 17th, 1963. Now, in Quebec, the beginning of the 60s was started what's called the Quiet Revolution, and there was much demand for separatism, separating from Canada, and there were people that agreed in doing it in a violent way, like planting bombs. One of the groups was called the FLQ, Front de Libération de Québec, as it was called. And on that period of time in May 16th and 17th, 1963, they specifically targeted an English and wealthy area, and that or affluent area, and that was called Westmount. And during the night of the 16th to 17th, they set bombs in mailboxes in that area. Some in the lower part of Westmount. Westmount's on a hill, and in other ones on the higher part of Westmount, which is called Upper Westmount, where the rich people were. Now, some of them exploded during the night, and the police force that handled it was called the Westmount Police. This was before there was a integration of all police units on the island, and they really couldn't handle the calls and the needs. They didn't even have a bomb squad. So what did they do? They call in the army. There's an armory in Westmount, which my father was part of, called Hillside Armory. And my father, Walter Leja, was trained in dismantling bombs. He understood explosives. So during that day, he handled 2 bombs, was able to successfully disarm them. And but the third one, which was on the top of the hill in Westmount, the results were different, and he was severely injured. His life was saved by a doctor on the scene. I'm saying an off-duty doctor who lived nearby and heard everything that was happening, and he did an emergency tracheotomy on my father. My father was shipped off to the hospital. In this particular case, it was St. Mary's Hospital, and he nearly died twice on the operating table. As it turned out, that the events of that, what my mother calls the accident, I was picked up from school at a time when my mother was working downtown, and we were both shipped to a local army base in Longueuil, which is in the same city right now as where we were living. And we were first told that he had died because the ambulance driver mistakenly went to the military hospital nearby called Queen Mary Vets, which is not a trauma hospital. And whenever the army or whenever they called and they found that the ambulance never arrived there, then the people in charge, not very bright, thought that he'd been sent to the morgue. And so when we got together with the base commander, he told us specifically that I regret to say that your father had died. And about 10 minutes later, after he had been talking about funerals and whatever, he got another phone call to say that he was alive and fighting for his life on an operating table. So that's one piece of it. Now, 11 months later, the Queen awarded my father the George Medal, and we were shipped off to Ottawa. My father and I got a picture of him, and how proud he was to have like received the George Medal. This was with Governor General George Vanier and his wife Pauline, very decent people. So that gives you some idea on the events of the 16th and the 17th of May. Now, I did an interview with a friend of mine named Norm Christie, who's a Canadian military historian, and for the interview was done for the King and Empire Foundation. We were talking about, it was an interview with me with the micro and the macro effects. In our particular case, the micro effects on my family, how it affected us. Norm called May 17, 1963 the day that Canada changed forever. Why? We'll have to find out. We will organize an interview, and then you're going to hear more about that. Now, politicians, academics, effectively a man in the street, whenever you ask them about the events of 1963, or say to 1969 or 1970, they almost unanimously believe that the October crisis is what was really the start of the troubles. That's the terminology that is used in Northern Ireland to talk about the war with the Catholics and the Protestants in Northern Ireland, and it's a good expression that applies to what we are talking about. Now, the politicians and academics, when you look back on their memoirs, they had zero or almost nothing talking about a period from like 1963 to 1970. Normally, it goes through the reasons why, and I'm sorry, these are some of the key politicians like Diefenbaker and Pearson, who switched time being prime ministers. Now, despite over 150 bombs between 1963 and 1970, it makes what makes very little sense is to blot this out of history. I mean, people who live through it, like myself, understand it perfectly, but to other people, it started with the kidnapping of James Cross and the kidnapping of Pierre Laporte and his subsequent murder. So that's another story. So right now we're going to look at the micro and the macro point of view of some of the events that happened during the 1960s. We'll look at you got to look at the federal or the Canada level. We'll say up to 1917. The provincial role. In a particular case, it would be far more relevant when you talk about everybody from Duplessis and the Great Darkness to Jean Lesage and the Quiet Revolution. And of course, we're going to talk about the Great Darkness and the Quiet Revolution. We'll talk about nationalism to separatism. And the other terminologies that came, including independence and sovereignty. Sovereignty became the terminology, the most popular, politically correct as time went on. We'll look at some of the FLQ, the original founders. Basically, there's three of them. We look at other Felkists. These are later FLQers. If it's version 4 or version 5, you decide. And in conclusion, then we're going to talk about René Lévesque. Now, the federal end, Canada, from 1933 to 1957, the Liberals are in power and predominant, and under that circumstances, it was William Lloyd Mackenzie King. In 1949, he went through the war years. He passed the baton to a Quebec City lawyer named Louis Saint-Laurent, who became, stayed prime minister until, and again, the Liberals really expected to continue on to be prime ministers and have the Liberals in power because the Conservatives are always weak. So it comes along 1957, and they get the biggest surprise because what's been described by Peter C. Newman, John Diefenbaker, it was called a renegade in power. So he became, he had a minority government. 1958, for whatever reasons, a snap election produced the biggest majority in Canadian history for Diefenbaker. The only bigger majority than that ever in Canadian history was 1984, and Brian Mulroney. Now, under those circumstances, here's a little secret: to have majorities, you need to get the support of Quebec. And in these two instances, the Conservatives, or the Progressive Conservatives, had a massive Quebec support. That was not always the case. Those support suddenly, at times, disappeared and went back to what was traditionally a Liberal support. 1959, Diefenbaker brings in the Canadian Civil Rights Act. Good thing. And on the other end, the absolute disaster is the Avro Arrow farce. The greatest jet fighter aircraft in the world is suddenly canceled by the Conservatives, and 30,000 workers. So many of them just end up in NASA, and were able to put a man on the moon based on that. And this was what we called at that time the brain drain. 1962, Diefenbaker gets a small minority, but there's all kinds of infighting that's going on. 1963, snap election, and Pearson finally becomes prime minister. Now, Lester Pearson replaced Louis Saint Laurent. He had a track record of being a diplomat, as well as receiving a Nobel Peace Prize for the UN force to, in this particular case, to keep the Egyptians away from the Israelis. And that wasn't good enough to be a prime minister until 1963. So when all the real troubles happened in Quebec, then Pearson was running the place. In 1965, another minority. This is when Pearson decides to change the immigration laws, because, as it turned out, it's hard to believe that the Conservatives were getting majorities of votes in large cities like Toronto and Vancouver. And Pearson got so angry that what he did was basically he opened up immigration, and as a result, a city like Toronto, especially Toronto, is one of the most, the most diverse city in the world. That's basically what happened. In 1966, the three wise men came to Ottawa. That's Pierre Trudeau. You'll hear his name. Jean Marchand became Minister of Labor, and Gérald Pelletier, who is a publisher of the of La Presse. So, and they made a major difference as time went on. So, 68, Pearson decides to retire. Trudeau wins the election. I'm sorry, Trudeau becomes leader of the Liberals. There's an election in 1968. In which the Liberals gained a majority in Canada, and it was like the first majority for the Liberals in, it seems like, forever, since since the 50s. Now, there was two events that happened. One of them was that was the Saint Jean-Baptiste parade, and there were some huge differences between Trudeau was part of a whole group of politicians that were in a reviewing stand, and it turned out that all the protesters were throwing rocks and bottles and whatever, and every other one of the politicians basically ducked and ran away. But Trudeau, for various reasons, we can go through that, stood up and put his fist in the air and said, "How dare you?" And that had a major effect on the probably on the election in Canada, because somebody was standing up to separatism, and he went big in Canada. Now, The other incident involved the weak leader of the Conservatives, whose name was Robert Stanfield. And what Robert Stanfield did was, I don't know, the CBC or one of the media were, just show him having a good time throwing a football back and forth with one of his followers. And so they kept filming this, and at one time as they threw the football, and the one time he dropped the ball, well, that became part of the election platform of the Liberal Party as time went on. Now, 1970, everything changed. We can go into that. Now, provincial, and we're talking probably from the time of Confederation. Again, most of the governments were liberal. In the 1930s, there was two conservative parties, so basically the vote was divided. And one of the members of the Conservative Party was a fellow named Maurice Duplessis, and he was able to unite the Conservatives into one party that he called the Union Nationale. Sounds very familiar to what happened in the beginning of this century when the Progressive Conservatives and the Canadian Alliance were two different conservative parties and were joined together. And within an election or so, they formed a minority and later on a majority government. So Duplessis wins in 1936. He has a snap election and loses in 39. So for most of the war years, he's out of power. And he comes back in from 1944 to 1959. In 1959, we'll just go through this, and actually I remember it. On September 7th, 1959, my parents, my father, were watching a series called Riverboat, which was basically a Mississippi steamer, and the captain was one who he'd won the steamer. He'd won the boat in a poker game, as we found out later on, and people like Burt Reynolds was like his star on TV. And so we suddenly get this announcement, we interrupt this programming, and part of the announcement was that Maurice Duplessis had a heart attack or whatever and died in Shefferville, Quebec. And they were thinking, Shefferville? First thing, we don't know where Shefferville is, until it turned out that it's an area basically where Mulrooney grew up in a place called Baie-Comeau. So it's in that area right next to Labrador, in the middle of nowhere. So Paul Sylvie replaces him. He's like second in command, and unfortunately, he doesn't make it until 1960, where he dies in office, number 2. And 1960, I remember on the TV seeing this huge funeral in this town called Saint Eustache. We had to travel to where we lived in, where we had a cottage in Point Calumet, which was right next to Oka, the land of the Trappist monasteries and the world famous cheese. And we always crossed over, and of course I would remember the names of the bridges across the last bridge that we had to cross over a river, which was called the Rivière des Mille Îles, and the bridge was called the Arthur Solway Bridge. That's not, so you get some idea on who the patriarch was for Saint Eustache, and between Paul and Arthur, that was, okay, so 1960, along comes Antonio Barrette, who I guess would have been the third choice, and he's got basically 5 months to prepare for an election. In June, the election happened, except the Liberals, because the Liberals have changed leaders, and they brought in Jean Lesage, who was a federal MP beforehand, and he wins. In 1960, I remember listening to this on the radio and hearing about all these cabinet ministers that were loose, that were being defeated. So it was, like at age 13, what's a cabinet minister? So, but, I just remember listening to that and seeing my father cheer as that happened. By the way, okay, so 1960 is clearly the start of what was called the Quiet Revolution. Duplessis was famous for the Great Darkness. We can end it with this. Now, 1962, the Liberals decide to have a snap election. Jean Lesage has brought in a person you'll hear about called René Lévesque, who was a CBC journalist, Radio-Canada journalist, let's get that better. And their goal was to create, to merge all the electricity companies in all of Quebec into one called Hydro-Quebec. Hydro-Quebec, the name did exist, and there was a small company beforehand. So the theme was called Maître chez nous, which meant master of our house. So with René Lévesque spearheading it, which is what he did very well. Now, Liberals win a big majority. And then it's almost expected that they're going to win the next election 4 years into the future, but that doesn't happen. The Union Nationale beats the Liberals, and a fellow named Daniel Johnson becomes famous because his two sons, Daniel Jr. and Pierre Marc, became premiers of Quebec later on, one for the Liberals and the other for a party you're going to hear about called the Parti Québécois, PQ. So, the next year, Daniel Johnson dies. So we have how many? We had we have 3 leaders of the Union Nationale that have died in office, over 4. You'll hear that. So, he now was named Jean-Jacques Bertrand replaces him, and he's got to fight the election of which is coming up in 1970. The leader of the Liberal Party is gone, and Robert Bourassa is in his place. And in a few short years, René Lévesque and between Jean Lesage and later Robert Bourassa are in constant disagreement. René Lévesque becomes what we used to call in the beginning a separatist, and we can call him now a sovereignist, sets up a party called the Parti Québécois, and that is fine. So the Parti Québécois runs in the 1970 election along with the Liberals and the Union Nationale, and the Liberals win a majority. So we're going to stop at 1970 as far as elections are concerned. Now we're talking about the Great Darkness versus the Quiet Revolution. Now, Quebec had a long history of nationalism. Why? They are a minority. The Francophones are a minority in a sea of Anglophones. You can understand that, okay? Between 1920 or 1930, one of the priests in Quebec was a very famous one, famous amongst nationalists. His name was Lionel Groux. Described what he called the revenge of the cradle. Well, if you're going to try to compete with the English, with the Anglophones, then you got to have, as a starting point, you have to have higher birth rates than them. And this is, as I said, which is called the revenge of the cradle. So the birth rates in Quebec were astronomical, what you'd find in parts of Africa, now. And they became world-class examples of how people, how many kids you're going to have. And I just happen to remember where I lived, which was in Longueuil. We won't get into that. One family had 16 kids. So that's what you find from the Great Darkness. Then what happens with the Quiet Revolution? Everything falls off the cliff. Suddenly the birth rate gets halved, and less and less and less as time goes on. So much so that they call it the Quebec model of dramatic decreases in birth rates. Now, the churches have had this huge influence in Quebec and this great association with governments like, with Maurice Duplessis. And suddenly, like I can remember, like in 1958, I was in the summertime in Point Calumet, which was predominantly French. It was only one church, and feeling guilty that, as a good Catholic, that the church law says that you must go to Mass. And so I did what I was told until I revolted against it. But the churches were packed with people, and the collection was collecting money was this huge production going on with altar boys carrying giant garbage bags made of cloth, to put all the change in. And then you went back in 3 years, and there was very, very, very few people in church. You could drop it to 1/3. So everybody suddenly went secular. If I look at Duplessis and some of his other legacies, which was in 1937, he created what was called the padlock law. And the padlock law meant that you could, if you were publishing material, or speaking material that was communist, then he had the power to be able to go in. If it was a location or a bookstore, if you were carrying communist propaganda or whatever, he could padlock it. And it's almost, in other words, there was one opinion on the matter. My God, it sounds like the woke opinion that we find right now, which wokest means that you have a license to be a demagogue. We won't get into that. In 1957, finally, the Supreme Court threw out the law. So basically, Duplessis had almost literally 20 years to do his good deeds. What else was Duplessis famous for? Well, they called it the pavement contracts, but if you describe it as government contracts that would happen in a riding or not. Well, if your riding didn't vote Union Nationale, you got zit. So your roads were much worse in your area than if you were, with a Liberal member, than behaving and becoming, like a good voter for the Union Nationale. We went from. My father described a bridge. I must have been 10 years old or whatever, called the Duplessis Bridge, which Duplessis was a powerhouse in a town called Trois-Rivières, had 3 rivers, and over one of the rivers was this huge bridge, and that had his name, and within 1 year, it fell apart. Something like there was like 4 or 5 spans that just fell in the water. Duplessis blamed it on communists and activists and whatever, and other people just called it incompetence and graft, and you could fill in the rest of the words anyway. Now we move from nationalism to separatism, independence, to what we call sovereignty. Okay, and we had early separatists. One was a federal service servant of all, if you can figure that. His name was Marcel Chaput, and the other was a fellow named Pierre Bourgault. I believe Pierre Bourgault was still around. Now, what else do we have? We with the Quiet Revolution, we we came up with the federal response to separatism, which is called the Bilingualism and Bicultural Organization, B&B as it's called. And we also got what's called the Three Wise Men. Okay, let's talk a little bit about nationalism versus separatism. Well, we can use the words nationalism, independence, or the more politically correct terminology, which was called sovereignty. Now, nationalism, that's the simplest. It seems like it's a constant war to get more power out of, in your particular case, Ottawa or the central government. You want immigration, you want this, you want that, you want a separate pension plan. That came later on. Now, the separatism, independence, sovereignty, under those circumstances, instead of wanting one little bit of power here and this power there, it's like you want all powers. Seems like it's simple. So it looks like a simple way of describing it. That basically nationalism is probably similar to, it has roots that are virtually the same as the separatism, independence, and sovereignty. The nationalism is sovereignty light, whatever you want to call it now. Okay, let's move to some of the FLQ founders. Based on the Pierre Valliere wrote a major book called The White Niggers of America, and he was talking about Quebec. And in Quebec, you were it was to a certain extent at various times like a colony. In at the time of 1837, there was a small amount of elites that controlled the poor peons. In this particular case, it was in Quebec, the Montreal power source, the church, and the English bankers and the other francophone elites that controlled the peons. And in Valliere's book, he associated the poor Quebecers like that with white niggers. What he called that, the blacks that before the Civil War in the South. So in February 1963, there was three people that set up the original FLQ: Georges Shooters, Raymond Villeneuve, and Gabriel Houdon. And they wanted to create a Quebec that through violent means. And they found bombs. It's very easy. You just go to a construction site and it's very easy to steal. They hit an army recruiting center in April, and the watchman, former Vimy Huet, was killed. So that's the first. And May 16th to 17th, they planted bombs in mailboxes. As I said, several of them had gone off, and there was the last three that my father had to look after. And one of them, the first two were fine, except the third one, we already know what happened. In the summer of 1963, all three were arrested. One of the key members is Georges Shooter, who was born in Antwerp, and he, at an early age, he was born in 1930, so he was, an early teenager that was involved in the Belgian resistance, and in the 1950s moved to Canada. And 1959 he met Castro, because Castro was coming into Montreal after the revolution, and he impressed Castro. Castro addressed the University of Montreal with a little help from Shooters. Shooters went off to Cuba for a short period of time, and of course met Che Guevara and learned bomb making, and also learned in Algeria. And 1963, based on his age, he would become the senior partner in the FLQ. So he was about 10 years older, 10 to 13 years older than the other two. That would cause some issues later on. After serving in prison, he was in 1967. He was deported to Belgium. Several other countries rejected him, but the only country that accepted him was Sweden. And so he actually worked in Stockholm, and specifically in the Stockholm post office. He was a mail handler. By the way, my brother-in-law has lived in Stockholm since 1967, so the chances are that some of his mail had been handled by Georges Soutel. 1994, he decided that he didn't want to live any longer, and he ended his life. And so that's the story of Georges Soutel. The other Felkists, as another way of describing him, come from a different era, so maybe they would be FLQ version 3, version 4. Okay, it was Jacques Rose, Paul Rose, the Rose brothers, Francis Simard. That's a cell that kidnapped Pierre Laporte. The other cell kidnapped James Cross. So the story with Pierre Laporte is that he was kidnapped and then eventually murdered. Now, the Rose brothers grew up in a village in a town called Ville-Jacques-Cartier, or Jacques-Cartier. It was situated on the south shore of Montreal, squeezed in between Longueuil on one end, St. Lambert, which was a little bit more Anglophone, and another, Lemoyne, Mackayville, and various other. It was an area that, like Mackayville, that was empty, lots of vacant fields and things of that nature. And after the war, what happened was that there was a huge housing crisis. So people automatically, now that a bridge called the Jacques-Cartier Bridge had been built, it made it easy to be able to get over to the South Shore, as maybe you couldn't beforehand. You ended up with dirt roads. I went through that. No sidewalks, poor housing, no control of housing. So the Rose brothers and Simard basically blamed the English oppressors, the same as the original members of the FLQ and people who leaned towards sovereignty. So they certainly knew of Pierre Vallière's book, The White Niggers of America. Now, the irony, and here's the connection. My grandfather moved from Kingston in the 40s to Ville-Jacques-Cartier, where he built a house on several. It was like a corner size lot, not corner side, but pretty large lot. My parents moved there in 1960, and they were building houses or whatever. And my father bought a house with just a basement built, the foundations, and so we happened to live on the land. But in the times that earlier than that, when I had to visit Ville-Jacques-Cartier, because my grandmother and my grandfather were there, I said the roads were terrible, and on the last corner, the last block to get to a house was the great big sign that says, "At your risk, à haut risque." My first exposure to French, but that's another story. My mother lived there until 2010. So basically, I grew up in the same town. Ville-Jacques-Cartier eventually became, in 1969, Longueuil. It's a little better off neighbor, and that part is fine. Now, in conclusion, did René Lévesque, was he really one of the people that, René Lévesque was the head of the Parti Québécois, and as time went on, René Lévesque eventually in 1976 became Premier of Quebec and shocked the country. But in 1970, was he one of the people that actually, I can't say killed the FLQ, because that's one way of describing it. I'd probably answer yes to that. Now, he rejected membership of any violent people into his party, or the Parti Québécois, or extreme people as well. So people like I mentioned, like Pierre Bourgault, were not welcome in the party. And there was an interview with him which you can't find on I haven't found it on Netflix, not Netflix, I'm sorry, on YouTube, by the CBC. Maybe it's in their archives. And it was done at the time of the murder of Pierre Laporte, and you see Levesque breaking down and crying, literally. And I think that those two events, and obviously Levesque was just absolutely condemning the whole concept of putting bombs in mailboxes or various other way of using explosives or violence. And I think that Quebec made a major turn towards, yes, sovereignty became more and more popular, and so what sovereignty was going to be gained through the ballot box. And basically at this particular point there was really no other party, other sovereignty party that was around. Now, conclusion, my wife always said that Quebec came oh so close to, as far as with violence and whatever, to Northern Ireland and the events that are there. And it's almost like, well, Quebec and Canada has been described as two solitudes, but frankly, that's not enough. There was there's always number one, that the Francophone Quebecers had like Irish roots, Anglophone roots, and whatever, and there was a huge intermarriage between English and French that went on in Quebec. This is unlike other societies. You wouldn't find in Northern Ireland, like marriages with Catholics and Protestants. It just did not happen. So they had a tradition, other countries as well, of not mixing. One classic example would be Belgium. You'd have the Walloons, and you have the Flamand or the Flemish, and they don't mix. They're in different areas, but they don't mix. And you find the same thing in the Balkans. So where you'd have disputes that are 200, 300, 500 years old. Nothing like that in Quebec. In 1963, my personal experience, and we're almost finishing this, after the accident, that's the word my mother describes, and it really great way of describing May 17th, 1963. I was a member of the cadets, and I had been a member of the Army cadets in Westmount, which meant that there was training program, whatever's going on, despite my father in the hospital, despite all this. So I'd be traveling, I was like age 16, on a bus, traveling from Ville-Jacques-Cartier, across the bridge, and through basically working class area, French-speaking working class area, which is predominantly Francophone, and would be, as time went on, predominantly sovereignist. And I'm wearing an army uniform, and I'm going back and forth every day for 6 weeks. That would mean was it 60 times, on a bus, as an Anglophone, and wearing a uniform which represents English oppression, and I'm traveling through these areas, and not an issue at all. As 5 years later, you never would travel that area. You would just take a subway and end up in downtown Montreal. But that's another story. And my first question would be, would I get the same warm reception if I was wearing a British Army uniform, either as a cadet or whatever, passing from one part of area of Northern Ireland to the other? And you know what the answer to that is. So here's my final thing. Why would I hate people for what they supposedly have done to me, or are going to do to me, when these people don't hate me? They're very tolerant people. So, by the way, if you like this, videos like this, just click the like button and subscribe. And I'm going to say thank you very much.